we're first going to introduce the different speakers. Jacques Balthazart, Claudine Julien, and Raymond Michel, by the student of the SBS.
So we are here to introduce you Professor Jacques Balthazart. He is a Belgian biologist who is now an emeritus professor at the University of Liège, and he was the director of the research group in behavioral neuroendocrinology, a research group that he created and for which he is still a consultant today. He obtained a PhD in zoology in 1977 at the University of Liège and has published more than 500 scientific publications and several books for the general public. Professor Balthazar's work focused on the neuroendocrine regulation of reproductive behaviors of birds mainly.
He is also known for his studies of the organizational and activational actions of sex steroids on the brain and behavior. So he came here today to present us his work about sexual differentiation controlled by steroids in animal behavior, and in particular how it can be related to the human case. So he recently developed an interest for the biological origin of sexual orientation in animals and humans, which may be mentioned in this conference. So we really thank you for being here with us today.
I'm going to introduce Claude Julien. She studied and obtained a degree in pharmacology. In the 80s, she wrote a thesis on genetic titration. And after having spent a long time studying rare genetic diseases, she turned herself toward more widespread illnesses, such as familial hypercholesterolemia. Since 2002, the aim of research has been to shed light on how epigenetic processes hold the memory of environmental impacts in a manner specific to the sex of the parent and/or of the progeny. In her life, she has written over 600 papers, and she did more than 50 years of research. She created and then coordinated the DES of medical genetics, and she has been elected and nominated member of the National Council of Genetics in universities. After that, she co-authored the book C'est votre sexe qui fait la différence on the impacts of the mother's lifestyle on the child. Now I will let her explain the work further.
And lastly, I will present Michel Raymond. So Michel Raymond is the research director at the CNRS and heads of the evolutionary anthropology team at the INSERM, so the Institute of Evolutionary Science of Montpellier. He conducts research in human evolutionary biology, in particular of the reproductive strategy, local adaptation, and medicine.
Okay, well first, thank you very much Camille and all the organizers of this beautiful day for the invitation. I'm very pleased to address this young audience and try to convince them of something which is hard sometimes to explain and to defend in France. So we're going to shift gear completely now and talk about sex. Now don't get excited, it's just going to be sex differences and their origin. And this is based on a book that I published a couple of years ago called Quand le cerveau devient masculin. It's only in French at this time. Now when you talk about sex and sex differences in France, it's usually leading to very heated debates, and the thinking is still very much influenced by writing that was made in the late 1940s by Simone de Beauvoir, who essentially said, you're not born a woman, you become a woman, which meant essentially for her that there's no sex difference, no gender difference at birth, but they develop during life and during ontogeny on the impact of socialization. Now, of course, this is 1949, and since then science has made quite a bit of progress, and I would like to convince you that there are actually some sex differences that have a biological origin, and part of the gender is also biological. So that's going to be the main aim of my presentation, show you that there are sex differences really that are independent of education. Then we will discuss what's their possible origin, what's causing them, and then finally we'll see whether this has any societal and environmental consequences, practical consequences of accepting that there is a part of biology in our sex and gender differences. Now, when you ask what are the origin of sex differences, there are two types of answers you can give to this question. One is proximal and one is distal. The distal is the evolutionary cause, and that's of course related to the fact that parental investment is very different in males and females. In sexual reproduction, which is based on anisogamy, which means that there are two types of gametes that are very different. One sex, the male, is producing a lot of gametes, while the other sex, the female, by definition, is producing a small number of gametes, and therefore the female will be much more choosy in her partner, sexual partner, while the male will not. And in general, this is a general idea, of course, and this will be associated with a lot of differences in behavior. In mammals, in addition, of course, female gestate and then lactate, and as a consequence, they invest a huge amount of time in each single offspring, and as a consequence, she's very, very reluctant before committing into that investment. So that's the long-term distal causes that will be discussed by Michel Raymond after me. At the proximal level, of course, you have to realize that by having X and Y chromosomes, the males and the females have a lot of genes that are different, and every single cell in our body expresses something like 450 genes that are differently in males and females. And that's true for the muscular cells, the liver cells, but also the brain cells. And as a consequence, of course, we have a lot of differences that emerge from that. Now we're going to review those differences now. This topic will be covered, at least in part, at least mentioned more deeply by Claude and Junie after me. Now, sex differences. First, the brain, its structure, morphology. There are lots of differences between males and females, men and women. In English, we say males and females for men and women, so I'm going to use both indistinctly. And these differences concern groups of neurons, total volume, volume of the white matter, gray matter, connectivity, etc. I'm only going to show you examples of the red, the points that are highlighted in red here, in the interest of time, of course. So first of all, groups of neurons. It's actually quite interesting that until fairly recently, well, recently in my history, of course, you were not born, most of you, but that's in 1976, it was broadly assumed and broadly accepted that there is no sex difference, no major morphological sex difference between the brains of males and females in any species. And then the first discovery was made by Fernando Montebo here at Rockefeller University, who was studying the brain of canaries and zebra finches, which are the small birds pictured here. And he showed that actually there is a whole circuitry that controls singing in those species, and the circuitry is much more developed in males than in females. The difference in volume of this nucleus, for example, is 3 to 5-fold larger in males than in females. But of course, this was a big shock at the time. A lot of researchers started to reinvestigate these questions in mammals, and it was soon found that in rats, similar differences were observed, and that in humans, this was also the case. So this is one of the initial publications of Dick Schwab's lab in Amsterdam, who showed that this brain nucleus here, which is called the bed nucleus of the stria terminalis, that's not very important for our topic here, is actually much larger and more densely innervated by this peptide VIP in males than in females. And examples like this are numerous now. There's about 30 different groups of neurons that are different in males and females. The brain volume. People thought that accepted that males have larger brains, but it was always thought, and it's still told now, that this is compensated by the difference in size. And the men are, of course, bigger, larger, taller, and so they have a bigger brain. Now, if you read these two curves, which relate brain mass to the age of the people, you realize that whatever the age of the person, men are bigger than women, but their brain is also larger by about 100 grams. This doesn't mean that men are more intelligent than women, of course. The brain volume is not a measure of intelligence. It's weakly correlated, actually, but it only explains 3 or 4% of the variance. So it's very weak, and Einstein had a very small brain, for example. But still, there's a difference. And this difference is reflected in many local parts of the brain. I'm not going to go into the detail here. This is detailed neuroanatomy, you will be interested. But parts like the mediotemporal cortex, which is involved in sensory processing, is more developed in boys than in girls. This part, which is involved in self-control, is more developed in girls than in boys. And this part, social interest, more in girls than in boys. And this is after correction for body weight, and this is at birth. So, and there's also this 6% difference in the total volume between boys and girls. So there are differences that are present when babies are born. These differences also concern the connectivity between the brains. So this is a study that's based actually on a very large sample of more than 400 men and 500 women. And you can see that on average, in general, the most important connection in men are antero-posterior, while the most important connection in women are lateral, from the left to the right side. This doesn't mean that the other connections do not exist, of course. This is highlighting what is statistically significant, so you don't have to misread this information. And again, we don't know exactly what this means in practical terms. There's been some speculation that we don't know exactly what it is. Now, sex differences. The central nervous system is different, and all pathologies affecting the central nervous systems are different. I'm not going to dwell into this very much, just a few examples. Anorexia nervosa is mostly affecting women, and autism, dyslexia, Gilles-Rattrell syndrome mostly affecting men. I think this will be covered to some extent also by Tony Julian, but she will not. But she's been talking a lot about this on the internet, so if you want to look at it, you can find it. Now, behavior and cognition, there are also quite a few differences here. I'm not going to be able to mention them all. Their magnitude is usually much smaller than what I've shown before. I will just discuss here empathy and systematization, and later on in the talk I'll talk about these two examples. Empathy and systematization. These are aspects of human behavior that have been studied in great detail by Simon Baron-Cohen at the University of Cambridge. And essentially this means that he's testing whether the people are able, the empathy is the ability of reading other people's mind essentially by looking at their faces and seeing what they think, what they express. So the classical test is to show a pair of eyes like this and ask people whether it's expressing any of these emotions. The test for systematization is a test where you're asking to find geometric forms into a figure. The task here specifically is to find out whether this form is embedded into that form. Men do a little better than women on this. Women do a little better in empathy. Now, I had a hard time finding what the answer to this problem is, so I highlighted it for you. So it took me a while. So you don't have to worry. All these differences, of course, only show up when you push the people to their extreme. It's not that one sex is unable to do one thing and the other can do it. It's just that one sex does it better with fewer mistakes or faster. Okay, so here it is. And finally, of course, sexual behavior, which is the only field where people would accept there is a difference, and of course we cannot deny it. The genitalia are different, there's no need to make your picture. The reproductive physiology is different, although they have constant secretion, more or less constant secretion of hormones. The female are cyclic. Sexual orientation is also very different, since most males are interested by women and most women are interested by males, so it's different. And gender identity is the same. Most XX people who are sexually female believe they're female, and XY believe they're male. But there are some exceptions, which is called transgenderism, and we'll come back to it. Well, we won't come back to that because there's no time, but we'll come back to sexual orientation. Now, you have to realize that these differences are not all or none. They're not qualitative, they're quantitative, which means that there is some overlap. And This overlap can be measured in statistics by a measure which is called the effect size, so that's essentially the difference between the group divided by the variance. And the effect size called D, here it's the D of Cohen, is actually for total brain volume 1.4. As a reference, the difference in body size, so the height is 2. So it's close to the difference in body size. The difference in some brain parts is much smaller, like the left hippocampus involved in memory. The difference is only 0.5. The difference in many of the cognitive aspects is also 0.4, 0.5. So it means that there's a lot of overlap. But when you look at the distribution, at the end of the curve, all people here are males. There's a lot of overlap, but at the end, all the people are males. And does this have any reflection, any importance? Yes. Because if you're mildly more aggressive, that doesn't have much of a difference. But if you're extremely more aggressive, then you're going to get into trouble in the society. And as a consequence, when you look at how many women and how many men are in prison for aggressive acts in all countries in the world, there's 221 countries that are in the statistics, you start with 18% of women in a few, with 18 and then 15% of women in a few countries. But you quickly drop down to less than 10%, and for the rest of the world, this is the first 36 countries, this is the last 200 essentially, there is almost no woman in prison for aggressive acts. Though you might say, of course, they're smarter than men and they don't get caught when they do something bad, but it's probably not the interpretation, it's just men are more aggressive. Okay, now, this is the first part where I convince you that there are differences. Now, what's the origin? Is it biological or is it educational, socialization, model, and so forth? It's a very hard question to ask in humans, of course, because you cannot do experiments. You cannot manipulate hormones in the baby's embryos, you cannot manipulate their genes, although we have the technology to do it. So the only thing you can do is actually do correlational studies, and you can look at clinical cases where either the genes are modified due to mutations or the hormones are modified due to some diseases, and let's see whether these differences are modified in parallel. You can also, for a given difference that you're interested in, try to see whether it correlates with other differences where you know that it's affected by genes or hormones. But all this will only remain correlational. And if you want to give sense to this correlation, you need to be doing causal studies in animals. And that's what I've been doing most of my life, actually. I never worked on humans, I worked on animals, but I'm really interested in humans for obvious reasons. And I'm just going to do a brief parenthesis now to show you what we know in animals in general. So, the most widely studied model for sex differences in animals is rat sexual behavior. When you put a male rat and a female rat in a cage together in the laboratory, they will do very different things. So the male will start sniffing the anogenital region of the female so that he knows whether she's receptive or not. He'll start mounting, and the female, in response to these mounts, will actually adopt a posture which is called a rhodosis. She will raise her hind backs so that the male can intromit and copulate, and finally there will be copulation. Now, these differences were thought for a long time to be the reflection of different hormonal status in the adults. So the females have progesterone, estradiol and progesterone. The males have testosterone. If you want to be schematic, of course, because all hormones are in both sexes, but let's just be simple here. But it was realized after 1969, a really foundational paper of Phoenix and collaborators, that this is not the explanation, because if you can take genetic males and genetic female pups and let them grow, and that as adults the male will show male behavior, and as adult the female will show female behavior, provided they have the right hormones in adulthood, of course. But if you treat the young pups who have a female sex with testosterone or estradiol, then these females will, as adults, become fully capable of showing male sexual behavior when given testosterone, and they will have lost completely the capacity of showing the female behavior in response to estradiol progesterone. And conversely, if you castrate the young males when they're born, so they have no testosterone during that time, then they will be able to show the female behavior in response to female hormones, and they will become unable to show the male behavior in response to testosterone. So the behavioral sex can be completely sex reversed by this endocrine manipulation around the time of birth. This has to take place during the last week before parturition and the first week after. Later, it's too late. It's not going to change. And once this imprinting by hormones has been made, it's irreversible. It will last for the entire life. Well, that's a very important concept, of course, derived from hundreds of studies in a variety of animal models, in mammals and in birds, and to some extent lower vertebrates. So this led to the general model that was already presented by Alfred Jost actually in the 50s for morphological characteristics, which means essentially that the genetic sex of being XX or XY in mammals will induce the formation of the gonadal sex, which is testosterone, testes versus ovaries, and then the testes will secrete testosterone during the perinatal life, and this will create the phenotypes or the behavior that the animal will be able to produce and to exhibit as adult. This was the story and was reasonably simple until the years 2000. Then came this infamous bird, which has been called the Gynandrophic zebrafinch. It was born in Rockefeller University in the animal facility there, and then transferred to UCLA in the lab of Art Arnold. And as you can see, zebra finches are not monomorphic, they're dimorphic. The male has a red patch and a striped breast. The female doesn't have the red patch, doesn't have the striped breast. But this bird was male on one side and female on the other side. And it was studied in great detail, and when people looked at its brain, the brain on one side was male, the brain on the other side was female, and the sex chromosomes on one side were male, and on the other side were female. Actually, I had a bird like this also in my lab that we've been studying. I'm still waiting for the sex chromosome now, but we have the sex difference in behavior. These nuclei that are bigger in males than females were bigger on the male side than on the female side. So what is this telling us? Well, it's telling us that the gonadal hormones, the hormones secreted by the gonads, cannot be the full explanation, because of course the brain was exposed to the same gonadal steroids on both sides. So this led to this idea that in addition to this model that I described before, there's also some effect of the genetic sex directly on the phenotype. And this has now been studied for 20 years by the lab of Art Arnold and various collaborators. They created a mice model in which they can independently manipulate the sex, the XY chromosomes, and the hormones. I cannot go into the detail here. I can explain if you want later. And they've been able to show that many sex differences in rats and in mice are actually due to these direct genetic effects. Now, this is all fine, but that's not why we're here. We're here to talk about humans. And all these mechanisms have also been identified in humans, actually. Now, how do we know that? Well, as I said, there's no way to do experiments, but what you can do is actually look at what's going on spontaneously and what's going on when you have mutations. So first, the genitalia, the sex organs, which everybody would agree are different males and females. Males have a penis, females have a vulva. This is how this develops during ontogeny. Around 6 weeks of gestation, the two sexes have similar genitalia, and that under the influence of testosterone, the genital tubercle will grow to form the penis. The two genital folds here will merge to form the scrotum, and there was a definite growth of this tubercle. In females, in women, and that's true of course for humans, but also true in rats and mice, there's no testosterone, so that the structure of the genitalia will remain relatively similar, with the genital tubercle ending up being the clitoris and the genital fold being the inner and outer labia. Now, how do we know this depends on testosterone? We know it because we have a number of diseases that have been extremely well characterized. One of them is the CAH, which stands for congenital adrenal hyperplasia. So that's a disease of the adrenal gland in which become impossible due to mutation. They cannot secrete corticosteroids and glucocorticoids, but they secrete testosterone. So as a result, these X individuals, they're girls, are exposed to an excess of testosterone during gestation. And they end up being born with, in the worst case, with genital structure being like this. It's a disease that's gradual, so it can be very severe or weak, and sometimes it's intermediate, but sometimes in the worst case it's this. It has to be noticed that this is now detected very early on in our Western societies. The girls are operated, their genital structures are corrected to go back to female, and there is a pharmacological treatment to block this testosterone secretion. So postnatally, they're raised as girls, but prenatally they have testosterone. And conversely, we have a number of mutations which result in what's called CAS, which is for complete androgen insensitivity. So the receptor for testosterone has been experienced a mutation, which means it cannot bind testosterone. So these X individuals, XY now, these are genetic males, these XY individuals have testosterone, have testes, but testosterone cannot act. And as a consequence, they are born as full female bodies. So we know that hormones are involved in this. Now, are they involved in any of the other differences I talked about? Yes. And there are a number of endocrine diseases that result in changes in these variables that are sexually differentiated. Due to the time, I can only discuss this congenital adrenal hyperplasia. So these girls have been exposed to too much testosterone prenatally, but not postnatally. What happens to them? Well, they've been studied in great detail, and one thing that's been studied, which I mentioned as a difference before, but I would come back to, is the drawing, free drawing. If you give a bunch of pencils, color pencils to boys and girls, when they're 5, 6 years old, let them draw what they want. They will draw, males will draw largely trucks, cars, and moving objects. Females, girls will draw butterflies, flowers, people, and so forth. This is spontaneous. If you do the same study with the CAH girls, these are drawings from CAH girls. They're extremely masculinized, and they've been told they're girls, they've been raised as girls since they were born, essentially. And this is not an anecdote, of course, this is based on a fairly large number of children. And this is the difference, actually. This slide should have come before, but this is the difference. This is what you see when you look at normal boys and girls. In boys, there'll be moving objects in 92% in Belgium. Yes, we're in English here. I'm saying I have to say this differently in French, but 92, but we're in English, so that's no difference. 92% of the objects, of the drawings will contain moving objects, for only 4% in girls, and vice versa. There'll be 96% of the drawings, including people in girls and much less in boys. And that's completely reversed in the CAH girls. Toy selection, well, boys and girls play with different toys, obviously. People would believe that this is because we tell them to do so. Well, it's partly true, it's influence. I'm not trying to say here that socialization has no impact. I'm just saying that there's something more than that. And this is supported by this finding, which is that 2 species of monkeys who have been given these toys that they had never seen were actually choosing differentially based on their sex. And the males were playing with the car here mostly, and the female was playing with the Muppets here, and she was actually cleaning the fleas from the Muppets. So there's some basis of this that seems to go back in evolution quite far away. And when you look at these girls who have had too much testosterone during ontogeny also, you find, okay, so these are the boy toys. The control boys play a lot with them. The control girls do not play that much. But if the CAH girl with too much testosterone, they're clearly masculinized in this direction, in this measure. And if you look at the girl toys, the girls play a lot with them. The control boys do not play much. But the CAH girl have lost interest in those toys. So this seems to be an impact of prenatal exposure to testosterone. You could come up with alternative explanation if you want to contest this, but that's the most likely explanation. And of course we can measure, well, we cannot deliberately for research purpose measure testosterone in the embryos because there is a risk of abortion that will be associated with that. It's a small risk, but it's there. So you cannot do it, but people are subjected, pregnant women are subject to amniocentesis for various medical reasons, and then you can measure testosterone in there. And Simon Baron-Cohen, again in Cambridge, have been looking back in the freezer of many institutes and collecting those samples, measuring testosterone. And when you look at that, well, of course, boys have more testosterone than girls, and even if there is quite a bit of individual variation. And this was known, of course, in rats and mice, but this is now shown in humans. And is this testosterone related to anything? Well, his conclusion is yes. Because when you do this empathy test that I was telling you about previously, you can see that this relates to fetal testosterone, so testosterone in the second trimester of pregnancy. You find here the empathy quotient, which is of course higher in girls on average than in boys, but it's also related to the testosterone, and the more the fetal testosterone, the less empathy you have. And as you can see, there's quite a bit of variation here. The regression line does not explain the whole variance, but there is an influence. And of course, these are boys and girls that were 6, 8 years old, so they had plenty of time to socialize and react differently to a given test. But at the same time, this correlation remains. And most interestingly, when you look at the other, at the next, when you now look at the systematization test, which is in this case finding how many triangles are in this figure, so you could count forever, the relationship is even better. So you now have the girls that are doing less well than the boys on the embedded figure score, but this relates to testosterone level. With the more testosterone during fetal life, better success in the systematizing score. So it seems that there is a remain of something that happened prenatally, even though again the correlation doesn't explain the whole data. Now, a brief section on sexual orientation now. So I said, of course, this is a very differentiated feature in humans. Most of the men and women are heterosexual, but there is a small fraction who are completely homosexual. It means they're interested in the same sex. And this is sort of a quantification, and the numbers, of course, the frequency is very debatable because the way you score this can generate a lot of variance. But in general, men and women are heterosexual, and there is a small fraction which amounts between 2 and 10%, depending on the study, that's homosexual. And most of the work so far has concentrated only on the extremes, because it's very hard to study, and there are some intermediates, but they have not been studied to any great detail. Now, is this sexual orientation learned during postnatal life? I think this is the strongest case where we think it is not. Because first of all, this sexual orientation is affected in all these endocrine diseases that I mentioned before. And I'm just going to give you 2 examples, of course, in the interest of time again. First of all, these CAH girls again. This is a summary that was made in 1984, but there is another more recent meta-analysis that shows exactly the same thing. In this study, they were rating the number of females that were not fully heterosexual at 10%. This is based on the Kinsey studies. In the CAH girl, this number raised to almost 40%. So 40% of them were not strictly heterosexual, they were partly or completely homosexual. There could be a number of reasons for that, because the genital reconstruction is actually very often imperfect, and sex with penetration might be different for those women, so there might be some social factors, but still this increase is very impressive, and there was still also 25% of the girls who refused to answer those questions, suggesting they're not totally at ease with that. But 40% were still heterosexual, which means that testosterone doesn't control everything, but it seems to have an influence. If you go back to the cloacal extrophy, so that's a genetic disease where the boys and girls are born with a completely messed up abdomen. Essentially, there's no penis, there's no vulva, there's no anus, everything is completely messed up. So they have to undergo a very complex surgery immediately after birth, otherwise they would die. And since it's surgically more easy to reconstruct female than male genitalia, they usually reassign a female sex, whatever their chromosomal sex is. And we have here a study with 6-7 cases of XY individuals, so they were all males, and the age of sex reassignment was 17 and 7 months in 2 cases, but then was 0 months, so it was done at birth in these 5 cases. And then they were, of course, raised as women. They were given estrogens at puberty to develop breast and enlarge the hips and everything. And when they were looked at as adults, their gender identity was, in these 5 at least, always male, and they were always attracted to females. So they had reverted completely their education to the endocrine condition they had, because you have to know that this disease does not involve any endocrine problem. So the testes are there and they secrete testosterone, and the receptors are there, so they were imprinted with testosterone prenatally, then the testes were removed, and still, this is what you see. Now, of course, you have to realize here that the sex of the hormonal sex prenatally matches the genetic sex, and this is a strong influence. In the CAH girl, the hormonal sex is opposite to the genetic sex, and this might create the fact that there's only 50% success. The other strategy to study the basis of homosexuality is to look at whether it correlates with other features that are known to be modulated by testosterone, at least, by prenatal testosterone, at least in animals. And all these variables, for all these variables, it's the case. There is a correlation between sexual orientation and these differentiated features. I'm just showing you 2 examples here. Again, otoacoustic emission. The inner ear is actually the organ of hearing, but it's also emitting small clicks. And these clicks are much more frequent in women than in men. But in lesbian women, these clicks are diminished, suggesting an effect of prenatal testosterone. And actually, you can get this same effect in sheep and in rats by treating them with prenatal testosterone. So this suggests there's an influence of prenatal testosterone. Conversely, in men, there's also a nucleus in the preoptic area, which is bigger in males than in females, in men and women. It's 2.5 times bigger in men and women. And Simon Levey in 1989, I didn't write it, or 93, around that. It's down there? Okay, 91. Thank you, Michel. In 1991, published a very famous paper in Science, which made a lot of noise, of course, showing that in a population of homosexual male that he has studied in California, the nucleus was decreased in size. Now, of course, this nucleus decreases in size with prenatal testosterone. Well, increases in size with prenatal testosterone in rats, we know that. We don't know if that's the case in humans, but this is a suggestion that, again, there is an influence of prenatal testosterone. The paper has been very much criticized because all the cases, homosexual cases, died from AIDS, and it was said that the disease was actually the cause of the decreased nucleus. But if you can see, there were quite a few males here in the control group that also died from AIDS, and they were along the distribution. So it's probably not the explanation, but the number of cases is small because you need to have the brain post-mortem to be able to analyze this, and the cases are hard to collect. So this was for the hormonal part. We have 5 more minutes. Take 5 more minutes. Okay. Are there also some genetic influences on sexual orientation? The answer is yes. The most convincing arguments is that when there's homosexual subjects in one family, the probability there will be others is higher, so this suggests a genetic influence. It could also be education, of course, but you can control to this for some examples by comparing true and false twins. So true twins are born from the same ova that divided, and have exactly the same genetic material. The false twins are not more similar than two brothers born at different times. And when you look at the percentage of concordance of sexual orientation in homosexual true and false twins, so the union with bivitellite, you find that there's always more concordance in the true twins than in the false twins. Now here, the first study that was made, these are different studies that were made, and several came after that which confirmed the phenomenon. The first study was showing 100% concordance in true twins, which doesn't mean that all true twins are homosexual, of course. It means that when one was, the other was too. This was never found again, but whatever the study, there's a difference between the two. So there must be some genetic influence. People have been looking for this in the last 20 years, probably. We haven't found the gene, but we know that there is something happening in the terminal part of the X chromosome, this region called QR28. This guy, Dean Hammer, published another paper in, I write it down, but it's also around 1990, where he showed that there was a correlation between homosexuality and some genes that were, some gene variants that were located in this region. This was replicated 3 times with success, 1 time not. On average, it was significant. This has been replicated a couple of times later, but still, we don't know. This is not explaining everything. We have now very wide, genome-wide association studies that have been made, which have found association between variants in the genome and homosexuality, but it's like 10 or 12 different locations, which each of them explaining only 3-4% of the variants. The total explain 25-30% of the variants at most. So we don't know what gene is involved. We know that many genes have to be involved, but we don't know which ones they are essentially at this point. There is a number of candidates in this region, but I'm not going to go into this in detail. And the final thing about homosexuality, there is also another prenatal mechanism, which is really exciting actually, which is called the older brother effect, or the fraternal order effect, which says essentially that for every older brother you have born to the same mother, your probability of being homosexual increases by 33%. That's a huge increase. That's been confirmed in more than 16,000 cases. I think these two guys here have been working on this for at least 30 years. This is a very confirmed phenomenon. So, and it's not related to the age of the mother, the age of the father, the number of sisters you have, the number of younger brothers you have. It's just related to the number of older brothers you have. And there's only one possible explanation to this, or it is a hypothesis to explain that, and it is that the mother creates antibodies to the male embryo, the male fetus she's carrying. And these antibodies, as they accumulate in the mother during successive pregnancies, will actually somehow modify brain development. And they've been selecting 4 proteins that were likely candidates for being at the origin of these antibodies. And they finally, a couple of years ago, assayed the antibodies for 2 of these proteins, and they found the antibodies to one of these proteins, which is called neurologin 4 Y-link. So it's a protein that's coded by a gene on the Y chromosome. The antibodies to this protein increase in mothers as they have multiple male pregnancies. So the idea is that at the first male pregnancy, these antibodies will go up. If there's a female pregnancy, that has no impact, but another male pregnancy goes up, another male pregnancy goes up, and as a consequence, the probability of being homosexual increases. This neurologin is actually controlling communication between neurons, so it's a likely candidate. It's not a proof, it's the cause, but it's a likely candidate at this point. So, practical consequences. Well, first of all, I just want to convince you that it's not environment or biology. I talked only about biology here, but of course there's a huge influence of environment and socialization on sex differences and gender behaviors. It's not or, it's and. And this reminded me of all the studies of Paul MacLean, who actually described the brain as being made of 3 layers. There's a very old layer, which is actually inherited from all our reptilian ancestors. And if you look at the hypothalamus, actually, it's very hard to differentiate a section from a human brain, from a rat brain, from a lizard brain. They're very similar in this part. They have the same chemical structure, they have the same connections and everything. And on top of that, develop the limbic brain, which is associated with emotions and feeling, and then, of course, our neocortex, which characterizes us to a large extent. But this part is controlling a lot of our behavior, including sexual behavior and orientation, and I think this part remains in control, whatever people are saying. The second practical consequence is that sexual orientation is actually not something that's learned from your peers. It's not influenced by your teachers. Having a teacher who's homosexual is not going to make you homosexual. It's not influenced by the parents. So the parents are not responsible. The individuals are probably not responsible also. It's just that they were made like this during sexual differentiation. And that's an important message to carry, I think. And then, of course, since there are all these differences in brain structure, brain diseases, and this generalizes to the general metabolism. The liver metabolism is different in men and women. We really need a sex-specific medicine, sex-specific research, and sex-specific medicine. And this has been realized about 20 years ago, and the NIH has emitted instructions that say that you must actually study both sexes when you do a preclinical study and a clinical study. And the doses of medications, for example, must be different for males and women. A dose of zolpidem, which is a sleeping drug, which is active in men will have a woman still sleepy on the next morning. And it's dangerous for her to drive a car with being exposed to that. So you need a sex-specific medicine. And this is something that's been really pushed forward by Claude and Julia, who's here, and we'll talk about after me. And finally, practical consequences. Well, these differences are not qualitative, so they're quantitative, there is overlap. So there's no reason why these differences should be used to discriminate. Women are classically less good at systematizing, and as a consequence, they're found in most cases in much smaller number in all the STEM studies, science, technical, engineering, etc. Now, I see that this school, and I talked to the director recently, has 70% women in the school. So this means that there are certainly some women who are capable of systematizing. But there is on average a difference in the extreme. But you cannot discriminate based on that, but you need to be aware of it, and maybe trying to get the same number of women in engineering and in health science is not going to happen, because the women are more interested on average in social relations and they're engaged in healthcare, and men are interested on average in engineering and then engage in engineering. And that's probably fine, because it's not being different doesn't mean being bigger, better, or worse. It's just being different, as long as, of course, there's no discrimination in terms of salary and so forth. And this discrimination is there and should be combated, of course, should be fought. So, that's what I wanted to say. Thank you very much for hearing me. I'm open to question now.
Any question?
In all of your studies, it seems that there are more affirmed homosexual men than women. Do you have any idea what that would be?
Yes, most of the studies are based on men, actually, and there are two reasons for that. One is that male homosexuality came out earlier than female homosexuality. I think the men have been claiming their homosexuality since the 80s, something like that. For women, it's been more recent, so there's been more time to study. The second reason is more genuine. It's because female homosexuality is more labile. The sexual orientation in women is more labile than in men. A man who declares, who makes his coming out, will never go back. He declares, and even if he has lived as a heterosexual subject for his life, for social convenience, once they will recognize that they're homosexual, sometime when the kids are gone or the parents are dead or something like that, they will never go back. Women, there are many cases known where they go back and forth. So there are a lot of bisexual women. And as a consequence, the biological mechanism behind it are probably more labile as well and harder to pinpoint. But the CAH are one example that was made in women, obviously because the disease affects women. There's a few studies coming out now, but there's less of that. There's the latest genome-wide association study included men and women and found genes that were associated with homosexuality in women. And some of them were the same as in men, and some of them were different. So it's a very complex situation. But it's true that there's more studies in men, definitely.
Thank you.
Okay, so when you talk about the gender gap in PhD, that's men tend to be more interested in hard sciences and maybe women in social sciences and such. How do you assess how much the social aspect is important and how much the biological aspect is important?
It's of course a very, very, very hard question because well, you cannot manipulate either. But what we know, there's only one answer I can give you is that the CAH girl who have been exposed to too much testosterone, they are on average selecting more men's type jobs, so engineering and everything. You'll find them more in men's type job than normal, than control women. It's not being abnormal, it's just having this disease. So it suggests that there is an influence of testosterone, but of course there is also a huge influence of society, of course. And we know that very well. To give you just an example, because the sociologists really hate what I'm saying. They don't want to accept any biology. But just one example of defending their theory of socialization. If you make the same test, which is it's a graphical test, and you present it as being a drawing test or a geometry test. If it's a geometry test, the boys will do better than girls. If it's a drawing test, the girls will do as well as boys. So that tells you how big the social influence can be. And it's huge. I'm not denying social influence, of course, but there seems to be a basis which is biological, and from day zero, there will be a difference in behavior. The boys and girls will have a different Umwelt. They will pay attention to different things, and they will grow differently under this very basic small influence that will grow later on and be amplified by society. That's what I'm trying to say. Thank you for the question.
Yeah, dealing with dangerous matter. So
yeah, I know. I've been treated as fascist and Nazi and everything, but I can handle it because.
So my question is that there was a big concern in CNRS and other things as to the number of male and female directors.
Mm-hmm.
So they were looking for a way to have equal number of male and female directors.
Yeah, that's the glass ceiling effect, which has been discussed ad nauseum, of course. Yeah. Again, I believe that both aspects must be involved, actually. On the biological side, women are the ones who carry the babies. And that's not something you're going to change in the near future. As a consequence, they develop a stronger attachment to babies than the fathers. Even though male parenting behavior exists, and males change their testosterone level in response to the offspring and everything in humans, that's been well documented, the female has a stronger bond for obvious biological reasons. Which means that she will devote less, should I say, effort to her career. She will consider their children more important. In addition, childbearing takes place between 25 and 35, 40 at the latest, when the clearly bigger steps in advancement in your career take place. And during this time, the woman is less available than the man. So that's another reason why she will not be promoted so much. Women are also less aggressive. We know that if you write a grant proposal and it's rejected, a male will resubmit it more times than a female, on average. She's more, it's a form of aggressivity which actually has some benefit. So all these biological things mean that women have a disadvantage, and to compete with that, you need to take really strong measures. Make quotas, but I don't think that's a really good solution. So you need really strong measures. On the other side, of course, it's clear that there's still discrimination against women in our society. It's still there, and it should be fought as much as we can. But I'm not sure we can achieve equality because the women don't want to invest as much. And actually, there's been an interesting development in Scandinavian countries where they have made everything they could to make it easier for women to proceed in their careers. So they gave the same amount of parental care, leave of absence to men and women and so forth. And what has been found is that the gender difference, the gender gap has actually increased as a consequence of that. Because the women took more half-time jobs than the men, even though they could both do the same thing. The women, since they had the possibility, they took more half-time jobs and they invested even less in their career than the men did. So I think there is something that's going to be really hard to fight there, and I don't think this is necessarily bad for society. It's nice to have two types of humans, and they complement each other very nicely. And I actually believe that if the world was run by women, it would be run much better than by Trump and by Putin and by Xi Jinping. But that's another topic, and we don't know. And when a woman reaches that level, she's often extremely competitive. So, pros and cons. It's a very, very long debate.
I have a question.
Where are you? There.
Since most of the research papers that you showed and results were conducted in, I think it was a majority in the US.
Can you hold the microphone closer to me?
The majority of the research that you showed were conducted in the US.
Yes.
Do you think there is a big cultural bias?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. A lot of this research is actually impossible in France. You cannot ask people what their sexual orientation is. In the States, it's not mandatory, but it's facultative. There's actually been a lot of money devoted in the States and in the Anglo-Saxon countries in general. That also involves the Great Britain, that involves Scandinavian countries, to do this kind of research. There is not much of that in France, and in France, the prevalent idea is still that biology plays no role. And that's why I'm here, trying to convince you and trying to convince the next generation and change this. Yeah, there is a cultural bias. And I think Islamic countries wouldn't be any better. I'm sorry to say that.
I also have a question regarding the environment which plays.
For sure.
Okay, so the question is, are you aware of studies following the impact of endocrine, neuroendocrine perturbant or interference that are everywhere as pollutants in our environment, let's say, the larger way? Are you aware of studies following any potential impact on sex differences and the emergence of any sex differences with regard to that?
I don't think we have any hard data on this right now. This is definitely a very huge concern. I'm actually involved in a discussion now for building a consortium with some people in Denmark who actually want to study these very specific questions and study how endocrine disruptors will affect these variables. We have in our lab a researcher who specialized in this, and she's finding effects of, in this case, BPA, so bisphenol A, on the age of puberty in mice, and in rats. The neurogenesis in the brain in adulthood, adult neurogenesis is affected by endocrine disruptors just during gestation, and actually these effects are seems to be transgenerational. She finds the effect until the F3, the third generation. So that's extremely concerning. There is in the popular press, and it's beginning to emerge in the literature, a huge increase in the number of people who declare themselves transgender. I don't think this is the statistics we had before, where people wanted to be operated and have their genitalia changed, but a lot of people don't feel at ease with their gender. It's usually adolescent girls, mostly adolescent girls, which contradicts what we knew before. Is this a reflection of exposure, of chronic exposure to disruptors? We don't know, but that's very concerning. But we don't have data at this point, as far as I can tell.
Just have a quick one, which is a question of neurobiology. Like you mentioned, adult neurogenesis is so important.
Yeah.
I was wondering whether you know some studies making the link between what can be adult neurogenesis and potential differences on sex purpose.
No. The short answer is no. Actually, there is still a huge debate in the literature now questioning whether adult neurogenesis exists in humans. It's clearly present in rats. In humans, there are two schools that are fighting each other through big papers and letters to the editor in Science, Nature, and so forth. Some saying that it's there only in the hippocampus. The olfactory bulb neurogenesis seems to be abandoned. In the hippocampus, there's this huge discussion. I think it's there, but in terms of sex difference in adult neurogenesis, that's very small in mammals. So I doubt that this would have any consequence because it's only a few neurons every day. So it's very, very minor. Contrary to these birds that I'm studying, the canaries, which change up to 1.5% of their neurons every day during the reproductive season. So that's where it was discovered, and that's where it's so impactful. I think we should leave some time to the other speakers now. Oh, there's one more? Okay, one more.
One question too. So do you think there is evolutionary reason for these biological differences between individuals of the same sex? Like for why some people are more prone to be homosexual? Is there like a reason in evolution for this?
I think yes, but I'm not going to answer your question because that's largely the talk of Michel Raymond. So I can come back afterwards if you're not convinced by him, but I'm sure he has very good arguments for that. Okay? Thank you.